So this is a story that I did not know existed until yesterday. Let's talk about the dark legal history of the state of Virginia and the Martinsville Seven. On January 8th, 1949, a 32-year-old white woman named Ruby Stroud Floyd entered a black neighborhood in Martinsville, Virginia. She was in the neighborhood to collect money for some clothes she had sold, but that's not important. By her account, she was going into the neighborhood and past railroad tracks. On those railroad tracks, she passed 4 black men. She says that when she got into the neighborhood, she was later assaulted by 13 black men, including the 4 men she had passed earlier. Word spread and the police quickly arrested 6 men, and by the morning, those 6 men had already signed confessions, implicating themselves and each other. All 6 men admitted to being present at the scene of the crime. A 7th member was also brought in and convicted. All 7 men were quickly indicted and the legal proceedings were very quick. The police state that this was because they didn't want the men to be succumb to mob violence, because as you can imagine, every white person in the surrounding areas wanted their heads. And here are the names and the ages of all 7 men. As you can notice, all of them were extremely young, except for Francis Grayson, who was 38. The 7 men, for some reason, were giving 7 different attorneys, and all the attorneys had different skill levels. And guess what? All 7 trials had 7 juries that were made up of all white men. During each of the trials, all of the defendants partially rejected the confessions that they made. In some instances, they said the police had written the confessions themselves. Sounds familiar. No trial lasted more than a day, no jury deliberation lasted more than 2 hours, and when it was all said and done, all 7 men were convicted and sentenced to death by electrocution. The appeals process was long and lengthy. Many civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, got involved, but no one wanted to hear it. The Supreme Court denied on 2 occasions to hear this case and attempt to overturn it. There was no fair trial. There was no fair due process for any of these men. They were coerced. And people started to point out the disproportionate proceedings of Virginia state's legal history. From 1908 to 1951, all 45 men put to death for sexual assaults were black men. The severity of punishment served to white men were cut in half. The appeals process by the NAACP did not work, and all 7 men were executed between February 2nd and February 5th, 1951. The reason I'm telling this story is because this week, the governor of Virginia pardoned the Martinsville Seven, saying that the executions handed down were racially biased. 70 years later, before he was executed, one of the Martinsville Seven was quoted saying, "God knows I didn't touch that woman, but I'll see y'all on the other side."
You want to know something that Aristotle really hated in Sparta? The fact that the women there were really powerful. Okay, so basically, when you died, everything went to your wife, your property and your wealth. So men were dying at a very fast rate. So what they would do is just remarry someone. They would die. They would get more money. Do you see where I'm going with this? It got to the point that during Aristotle's time, the richest women in Sparta controlled about 40% of Spartan territory. They also were richer than both Spartan kings combined. Like, every single one of these women had more money than both of the kings. Like, the kings didn't have to come up to generals or whatever. They had to come up to the typical Spartan woman and be like, "Please fund the war. We need you."
If you are in any of these categories, stop scrolling right now. Many of you have seen the video saying,
"If you are black and or queer, do not fucking stop for gas if you are driving through Vidor, Texas. Do not."
The reason for this is that Vidor, Texas is something historically called a sundown town. Sundown towns are towns all across America, primarily along Route 66, and the sentiment was, if you are black, indigenous, or a person of color, you are not welcome here after dark. In order to protect themselves, black people developed green books so that they could travel safely. If you want to know more, check out this book. The writer of that book also helped to develop this website that has a master list of active and historical sundown towns, and the sheer number was astounding. I was looking for Vidor, Texas, and sure enough, it was on the list. There are comments and testimonies and statistics. I really encourage you guys to share this information because it could potentially save somebody's life.
This is where 300 Spartan warriors faced the Persian army at the Battle of Thermopylae. The battlefield is still here to this day, about 2 hours away from Athens. Leonidas met his fate, and Xerxes decided to behead him, which was rather dramatic for the Persians. Also, The Persians were Zoroastrians, so they believed that they could not bury the dead. Many hundreds and even more thousands of Persians lay dead here on this battlefield after this bloody slaughter. But Xerxes was embarrassed by this terrible loss. Thus, he asked his men to throw dirt on these bodies and bury them, also going against his common practice. Now, the movie shows this area being very full with rocks, very barren, very kind of hellish looking, but it's actually very green and has a beautiful natural spring down there. Stay curious, my friends.
This children's game has a dark backstory, part 1. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. It's a game often played at sleepovers, but it actually dates back to the 17th century in Europe when there was a resurgence of the plague, and it was said to be invented by a group of girls who were chanting it to lift up their friend who had died from the plague. This children's game has a dark backstory, part 2. Bloody Mary is already a creepy game. You take a candle into a dark bathroom, you say Bloody Mary 3 times, and wait for her to appear. But she's actually based on Queen Mary I, who led the Marian persecutions and who had more than 300 people burned at the stake. But what's also interesting is that it's been shown sometimes when people are put in dark or dimly lit rooms for prolonged periods of time, they really do hallucinate.
Japanese kamikaze pilots were basically suicide pilots. The Japanese believed that in order to save their country, they needed pilots to hit the ships 100%. This is where the idea of suicide pilots comes into play. The Japanese felt like they had enough people to sacrifice for their country. Being a kamikaze pilot was considered brave. All of the men who were kamikaze pilots had honor to their name. Many soldiers were also happy to become kamikaze pilots. And before they hit any plane, they yelled, "Long live His Majesty the Emperor."
Hey guys, I'm going to tell you the crazy story about this guy right here. His name is Vasily Arkhipov, and no exaggeration guys, he literally saved the world. I'm going to do the story in 2 parts. Now our story starts during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the US had just ordered a naval blockade on Cuba. In other words, they weren't allowing any ships to go into Cuba. Now Vasily is second in command in a submarine heading from Russia to Cuba. This submarine is equipped with a nuclear bomb the same size as the one the US dropped on Hiroshima, so it's a big one. Now, the US tells Russia that they're going to start dropping practice shots into the water so any submarines that are down there can come up and identify themselves. And here's where it starts to get messed up. The sub these guys are in is already too low in the water, so when Moscow sends out that message, they don't get it. They start getting hit by all these practice shots, and they think that's it, World War III's happening. So the captain of the ship decides, okay, it's time to shoot the nukes at the US. Now, the catch is that the captain does have authority to shoot out the nukes, but only if he gets approval from his political advisor that's on the ship and his second in command, Vasily Arkhipov. Remember, guys, the ship is shaking. They're getting hit by shots all the time. The political advisor caves in and decides to go with the captain and agrees to shoot out the nuke. So now Vasily is the only thing that stands between that captain and that big red button. But Vasily's not sure. I mean, they are getting hit by all these shots, but he doesn't know. I mean, they could be anything. So he puts his foot down and says that they should resurface before shooting anything to see what it actually is. Captain doesn't like that so much. They get into literally a brawl. Vasily ends up winning and basically by forcing the submarine up to resurface in the water. And lo and behold, there's no World War III. But if it weren't for Vasily Arkhipov, the US would have gotten hit by a nuclear bomb, and the world as we know it would be completely different.
This is Paul Winchell. If you're not familiar with his name, you're probably still familiar with his work. He was the voice of Tigger. He did a ton of voice acting stuff. He did ventriloquism. You can see one of his puppets here. He also had his own TV show. He was really immersed in the Hollywood world, and so he was going to all of these Hollywood parties. And at some point, he got really interested in medicine, and he was reading up on it, and he was telling some guy this at a party, and this dude at the party is like, "Hey, you should meet my doctor friend. I think you'd really enjoy talking to him." That doctor friend, by the way, was Dr. Heimlich, the guy behind the Heimlich remover. And so he meets this doctor, and the doctor is like, "Hey, you should come watch me do an open heart surgery. I think you'd find it really cool. Because this was back before they had all these regulations. And so he was like, oh my God, I'm totally going to do this. And he did several times. He went and watched this open heart surgery happen several times. He kept going. Part 2's already up. Okay, this is my Paul Winchell story part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend you go watch that before watching this video. Okay, so he's watching all of these open heart surgeries, and he's like, damn, the part where they die because their heart can't pump blood kind of sucks. If only they had a fake heart that could do that for them. So then he went home and designed one, and he made like a whole ass prototype, and he showed it to all of medicine, and they were like, damn, this shit slaps. And so then, of course, they got it more developed, and it's something we still use today. And so obviously after all of that, he went back to school and got a medical degree and decided to become an acupuncturist. This is all while he was hosting his own TV show, by the way. And eventually he gets bored of acupuncture and decides he wants to become an inventor. And he invented the disposable razor and a bunch of cool stuff that we still use today. And I know all of this because I'm obsessed with Winnie the Pooh. I love Paul Winchell.
Insane life of Julie Daubeny, the 17th century sword-fighting bisexual opera singer. She scandalized France by cross-dressing like a man and fencing, which she was so good at that once a man she beat refused to believe she was a woman, so she ripped off her top and asked the audience to judge for themselves. She became a star of the Paris Opera, but that didn't stop her from fighting in duels where she killed at least 10 men. At one point she had a death warrant out for her, but the king found her so entertaining he pardoned her. She also loved to seduce women. She once took vows to enter a convent just so she could have sex with one of the nuns before she burnt the whole convent down.
This guy made a human computer out of unemployed hairdressers during the French Revolution. All right, so during the French Revolution, they had a problem, right? Nobility didn't pay taxes before the revolution. Now they had to, but because they hadn't paid taxes, no one really knew how much taxable land they had. So they had to figure it out from maps, and that required a lot of trigonometry, and they did not have calculators. So they used these things, tables of logarithms, and there were literally not enough mathematicians in France to make the tables they needed. And so in walks Gaspard de Prony with an idea that seems completely insane. Rather than have a few talented mathematicians work on it, have like 100 normal people. So he breaks down each logarithmic function into the most basic steps possible, and then he hires a bunch of unemployed hairdressers, like the revolution just happened, so this stuff was no longer in style. And so these hairdressers were basically a human computer.
On my page, we tell the true history of the United States. And in this series, we'll be discussing each of the 46 presidents of the United States of America. We move on to number 8, Martin Van Buren. He created the Conservative Democratic Party of that time. He was absolutely against the abolishment of slavery because he did not want to divide our country. Who else was taught in school that all men were created equal? I guess that only applied to white people. He presided over one of the worst economic depressions in our history. He forcefully moved 20,000 Cherokee natives to Oklahoma and more than 4,000 of the Seminoles from Florida. There is not much known about Martin Van Buren, but we do know that he owned enslaved black people. Just how much blood is on this man's hands? William Henry Harrison. Next.
Today I want to show you guys some amazing pictures of the ancient city of Pompeii, literally frozen in time from a volcanic eruption. On August 24th, 79 AD, the enormous Mount Vesuvius erupted. This sent a blast of ash and toxic gas barreling through the city over 100 miles an hour, killing everyone in its sight. The city sat perfectly preserved under a layer of ash for over 1,700 years. In 1864, a team of excavators slowly started uncovering the site, and here are some photos of what they found.
Japanese is wearing a kimono cultural appropriation or cultural appreciation. Kimonos date back to the Heian period. Over time, they developed into a sign of alliances and identity, often passed down through family. It was one of Japan's key exports during the 18th and 19th centuries. Sharing the kimono is still embraced in Japan today. Regardless of who you are, it's a way to celebrate Japanese culture. But context is very important, and in America, Japanese Americans have faced extreme racism. Historically, anything that isn't Western wear has been un-American, often treated as a costume. So